It's never good at DNS to be sad.
Ganesh, you've got a story about an interesting bug in DNS that allows side channel attacks, where an attacker can sort of inject themselves in um, and basically poison a DNS query. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Thanks, Matt. This is not a new attack, but I think the novel ways to basically leverage the word attack we already know, which is a cache poisoning attack. I think which was prevalent in 2008 year, and after that, I think most of the vendors kind of actually plugged this hole. This came recently, basically from the academics from University of California and some university in China. They collaborated between themselves. They presented a paper based at conference. At I think a conference happened in November second week, CCS 20 conference, and they got actually an award for that one as the best research paper. What it does is in the side channel attack, basically an attacker can leverage as a middle-in-the-man attack, and they can own specific servers in their own domain, and they can send whatever the responses they want to send to the victims. In that way, they can basically own the server, DNS queries and the responses, everything. I think it kind of goes in hand with your story, like where various domains came in place. I think this is one of the ways they can leverage this attack also. But that being said, what they did is basically in order to basically plug this attack, they came with the process of DNSSEC. We all are aware of it. DNSSEC can basically control this one, but the problem is DNSSEC is not widely deployed, or maybe not everybody is using the DNSSEC. But what they did, these academics did, is they took that advantage of DNSSEC into context, and they turned into basically leverage to initiate another side channel attack. Why did they do it? I think a little brief introduction about how DNSSEC works is, I think for every transaction, whenever it's trying to contact with the server of DNS request, DNSSEC by algorithmically try to create some cryptography, right? For each server and each request with some, which they call it transaction ID. So which is that unique? So in this SAD attack, which by the way they call it SAD DNS attack, which stands for side channel attacked DNS, and I think they came with this SAD acronym to call this conglomerate. I think 2 or 3 side channel attacks. What they did is by using these transaction IDs within the SAD DNS attack, what they do is they try to send the DNS query to one of the victims. Victims in the sense, whichever the device. It could be a home router, which could be some publicly available DNS router forwarder, whatever the device they can find. What they do is they try to initiate a reply from these victims. How are they doing it? They're leveraging the brute forcing of the transaction IDs. In this scenario, for example, this attacker ID, they try to send, I think, at least 50 different combinations of transaction ID and the port number to the victim. So by observing the responses they're getting from these responses, or maybe lack of the response, they try to figure out which would be the possible transaction ID. Once they're finding those transaction IDs, they're leveraging it to carry on the various additional actually attack vectors. So how effective it is? When they did, I think the academics claim they can scan 1,000 different transaction IDs per second, which eventually basically I think a little over a minute they can scan a whole 65,535 ports. So it's pretty fast, and they're leveraging it to basically attack this attack. And which are, what kind of servers, maybe how many servers are vulnerable to these specific vulnerabilities? They carried out all these attacks and various open resolvers like the Google, Open Google, their DNS, all of these servers seems to be vulnerable. But the good news is the fix is very easy, and most of the vendors already have fixes in place. It just needs to be whoever is running these resolvers, they have to go and update the patches with a different version. It's not only prevalent to Linux, it's also prevalent to some Windows Server. I think version 1809, I think it comes from 2019. And some of the Mac OS as well as the FreeBSD, which is basically, I think Mac OS is based on. So that's about the story. But what about the mitigations? A mitigation, some of the recommendations they provided is disable the outgoing ICMP responses. For example, because they're doing the brute forcing, don't give them the information outside. By blocking the outgoing ICMP messages, you're kind of limiting the exposure and also mitigating these SAD attacks. And the second one is stringent use of DNSSEC. I know if everybody's not using, maybe it's a time to use it more prevalently. But I know DNSSEC has own sets of problems, but we are not talking about that one. But in this case, DNSSEC will actually provide the protection against the transaction ID. That's one of the suggestions. And another interesting one I did not really clearly understand, but I think it makes sense. Some sort of DNS cookies with the forwarders as well as the DNS servers. I'm not clear on that one. I think it's something DNS cookies, whenever they visit any of the sites and maybe come across a forwarder resolver, they will get some sort of exchange of a cookie and they will store it locally. And subsequent transactions, they will try to match with that. If it is not, it's an anomaly. I think that's my understanding. I felt that this is not a new attack, but the way they exposed it actually is still vulnerable. I think there's always something happening with the DNS. And as we discussed before, DNS is based on trust also.
Wow, this is pretty wild.
Yes.
Now, this is side channel stuff like this is always really interesting because someone had to sit there and think about, all the different side effects of what goes on these transactions, and then, wow, I mean, it's good that there's a patch, and I hope it gets applied. There's probably going to be network stacks that just never get this patch,
that's always the case, yeah.
But
the good thing, actually, they did do a responsible disclosure. I think they informed all the vendors.
Mm-hmm.
Once they came out, I think they published the white paper, and it kind of came up. That's a good thing. But still, like Matt, you said, there's always some outlier, and also even the DNS case there. And for years, we're still dealing with non-DNS servers, right? So it's a challenge.
Well, like DNS servers that are vulnerable to this, if they're running like on a regular Linux server, they're probably going to get a patch. But the Linux kernel patch here, I expect there's a lot of like IoT devices out there that are never going to get patched for this. That's always a bummer, though, right?
Yeah, I think in one of the scenarios, basically that's one of the devices they kind of used for their experimentation. It's not really an IoT device, but you could say it's like a small home office kind of router, which they leverage to basically send the responses and get the responses back and see whether any specific port is open or not. Right, it's a really interesting study and the proof of concept. I mean, if you guys really find some time, I think it's really educational. I did not really understand about the transaction ID until what's the value of it, until I read about this white paper.
All right. I'm going to have to look into this one. I'm already starting to look at the official website for it, and there's a lot of really interesting little notes here.
Just kind of goes to show you how, the life cycle of all these different attacks and things is the breadth of it is so massive. It could be an application, it could be your infrastructure, it could be anything, and you have to kind of be aware of all of it and, make sure you're patching all of it. And, it's very difficult, I would imagine, for most organizations.
It goes to the same point like we discussed in the previous stories. This was a big bug in 2008, but it has been dealt very quickly by all the vendors. But they use that specific bug, but with a novel technique to make it obsolete.
Right.
So, yeah, like you said, patching is always the key. And whenever you're introducing something new, I think that needs to be given an extra pair of eyes to observe what are the ramifications. I mean, it's easier said than done.
It looks like not only are you going to have to patch and I'm going to have to patch, everybody may have to patch.
Right.
There's a lot of moving parts, right?
And
So
all these public Wi-Fi's got, who knows, how they're being managed, and all of the, host machines connecting to those public Wi-Fi's. There's probably a good number of them that are not, up to date on those patches. So they're getting infected, and, it's just a vicious cycle.